Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in and joining us on our webinar today. My name is Luke Bader. I'm Director of Membership and Programs at the FAIR Institute, and we are excited to be hosting this webinar in partnership with the Institute's founder and technical advisor, Safe Security, and it is titled Out with the Old, In with the Future, Why Operationalizing CRQ Can't Wait. Now, before I get into introducing the webinar today and our speaker, I want to just quickly go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to, upon completion of the webinar, you will be sent a recording of the webinar, as well as be able to share the registration link with colleagues or with your network who are unable to attend the live showing, and they just register through the platform, and they will be able to be seen an on-demand version of this webinar with a copy of the slide deck as well. So that will be available for all attendees, and the recording of the webinar will also be uploaded into the FAIR Institute member resource library. If you are not a member of the FAIR Institute, I would suggest going onto our website under the Get Involved tab and signing up for membership. There is a free level of membership, the general level, and then there's a contributing level as well, which is an annual fee of $150, and that gives you access to additional resources and discounts on training and such and things like that. So if you're not a member of the Institute yet, I would highly encourage you to apply today and get in touch so that you can get access to resources like these webinars and many more. With that, we will also have some time for Q&A at the end of this presentation. So throughout the presentation, please put your questions into the Q&A module in the platform, and we will get to as many as we can within the hour we have allotted here for the webinar today. We have about 15 or so minutes at the end for most questions. So as you go through, again, a reminder, please put all of the questions into the Q&A module that come up from yourself. So with that, I'm going to pass it over and introduce our webinar and our speaker today. Our speaker is Vince Dasta. He is a senior partner for risk strategy at Safe Security. He has over 15 years of experience in cyber risk management and compliance, and he is a dynamic executive and a very well-versed subject matter expert who enables different organizations to address very complex cyber risk challenges. And Vince today is going to be speaking to us on how Safe Security has used FAIR to discover how their customers and their leading teams have achieved putting FAIR into practice at their organization and draw on some real world examples of what a mature cyber risk program really looks like. So we're excited for this. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Vince. Looking forward to answering a lot of folks' questions here. And with that, Vince, I think I'll turn it over to you to get started.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Luke. Appreciate the introduction. And just to give a little background, so Luke gave a great intro. I'm at Safe Security. I lead a customer success team. So we support a lot of our existing customers, as well as lots of organizations that are starting off on this journey, right? I've been at Safe for several years. Before that, I led a product team on the cybersecurity side. Before that, I was at another organization building out risk quantification models and things. And before that, I was in consulting and led a practice and been involved with the FAIR Institute for many, many, many years since really the very beginning. So I've seen a lot of things, and excited to talk about this today, and also answer some questions. So looking at the registration list, it looks like we've got a great set of experience, some familiar names that have been around this community for a long time, and some that are new. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to give a little bit of a background. We're going to talk about this generally, but I want to make this very practical, right? I want to talk about how we do this at Safe, right? What our team has learned over the years of operationalizing and helping companies actually build out the programs and the processes and the things that are required to make CRQ and FAIR-based programs actually valuable, right? So when we look at this, the question always is like, why are we still talking about this, right? So I went back and I wrote a blog post about 8 years ago on this very topic, right? How do we operationalize fair and risk quantification within an organization, right? We have been growing as a community for years and years, right? We're out in the world, right? Everybody knows about this, right? None of this is new, right? So why is this still the thing, right? Why is this the thing that companies are struggling with the most? Is operationalizing, actually getting value out of this, right? So scaling and growing. We've talked about this, at the FAIR Institute for a decade now. Well, FAIR has been the future of risk management for a decade, right? And why haven't we gotten there, right? And I think there's a couple of key things that I've seen over my career that we're going to talk about a little bit here, and also some common themes. When I talk in the community and when I help companies that are struggling with this, right? There's a couple of things, but if it's so hard, right? If this is such a challenge, right? Like why are we still pushing this, right? Why is this such a big deal, right? And if you look at this, right, the stakes, what's at risk, the attention that this is getting, right? We're hearing over and over and over again, right? I talk to executives, I talk to CISOs, and every single one of them, again, for the last, I don't know how many years, has said that this is the issue, right? Like when we look at, the challenges that we're trying to solve and the things that are driving this, right? We need to pay attention to this problem, right? But a lot of companies and a lot of practitioners are struggling to cross that gap. And you go and you take your FAIR training, right? We read the books, we talk to people at these communities, but why is it so hard to actually get up and running? And so I think when we think about that, we need to talk about the guidance that we're seeing from a regulatory perspective, right? We're seeing things like the SEC guidance, like NIS2. We're seeing things in the NACD handbook that are telling us over and over again that we need to manage risk. We need to talk about risk in business context, right? There's liability and regulatory requirements to do this. All the frameworks that are out there, right? The NIST CSF, the 8286, right? We'll talk a little bit about some new things from the FAIR Institute, right? So what does it mean to actually operationalize this? And the way I think about this and the way that we approach this from SAFE is that, right, operationalized CRQ is different than doing risk analysis or ad hoc risk management. It means that we've integrated quantitative risk management into the day-to-day decisions, the processes, and the culture of the organization, right? So it's about making FAIR and CRQ an ongoing part of our program, not a one-off report, not a periodic exercise or an academic challenge, right? And what we're going to talk about is how do you actually do that? And this is, again, easier said than done, right? And there's, it's easy to talk about this, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to share what I call the common failure modes from companies that are trying to operationalize this. So again, I've worked with hundreds of companies at this point that are doing this and have tried this, that have been very successful and have tried this and failed, right? And when you look at the kind of the corpus of organizations that are struggling or have struggled with this, the program typically fails on one of 5 modes, right? And so if we think about this from an engineering problem, right, we're trying to integrate process change, we're trying to do new things, we're trying to add value to the business, right? But the things that are most commonly getting in the way, right? So when I've analyzed kind of these programs, the things that are happening, they fall into a couple of categories, right? first, right, and we talk about this as like chapter one, scope. I see very commonly organizations that are trying to boil the ocean. They're trying to do too much too quickly, right? And what's happening is that they're getting lost, right? They're losing momentum, right? I hear about data all the time, right? That we don't have enough data. We're trying to get more data. We're trying to get better data, right? We see this all the time. We get the kind of the one and done approach, right? We do an assessment, right? We're conducting a fair analysis, right? Well, that's not, as we talk about, that's not the way to build out a program. That's not the way to make this successful. We see like kind of this phenomenon of the risk team in the corner, right? Where, you know, the risk team is not integrated into the decision-making process, right? It becomes a kind of an academic exercise. It's not very vital to the process, and it gets forgotten about, right? And then we talk about scoring. We talk about this. I'm going to talk specifically today around the FAIR side of this. Of, you know, while FAIR is the de facto global standard for doing this type of work, there are still challenges with this, right? We still hear it, you know, after, you know, 15 years at this point. You know, it's not defensible. It's hard to do. It's a black box, right? Despite all of our best efforts, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. You know, the other thing I think that overarches a lot of this is, you know, there is a perception a lot of times when companies are doing this, and when you start out in this field, you know, that this becomes, you know, this is perceived anyway as an academic exercise. It's a math experiment, right? We've all heard about CRQ. We've all seen all the fancy charts and the graphs and the math models and the, you know, Monte Carlo simulations and all these types of things, right? And, you know, the challenge with that is that we have a perception out there. And so when we start to get outside of our own world and we start to socialize this across the organization, we run into that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. You know, the other piece of this, and, you know, everybody here that's been through FAIR training, that has done this in the real world before, right? We know about this kind of, you know, perfect precision problem, right? Where we need, you know, as soon as we start quantifying things, as soon as we start putting numbers to things, the expectations has to be perfect, right? We're going to talk a little bit about how to get over that. You know, the other thing, and I'm going to talk about this in depth, right, is that CRQ fundamentally is a decision-making exercise, right? Why are we doing any of this? And it's ultimately to help our, you know, our leadership, you know, our teams, our companies make better decisions, right? So if we can't do that quickly, and if we can't do that effectively, right, CRQ becomes a hobby, right? And I've worked with lots of companies that this is the problem, right? It's a fun thing that we're doing, you know, we spend a lot of time on it, but it's not actually adding value. We're not actually helping companies make decisions, right? And, you know, I think we highlighted this at FairCon, and I think that this is an interesting statistic. So this is a survey, 100 CISOs across all different industries. They were asked, how many of you need CRQ in your day-to-day job, right? And the answer was 7% of them. 7% of the surveyed CISOs said that they need CRQ. Okay, so let's go back, right? We just talked about this. This is a huge challenge, right? We're facing all this regulatory pressure. You know, there's liability for the board, right? All of our risk management frameworks are telling us that we need to do this, right? You know, we have the de facto standard, we have the approach, we know how to do this, right? We've got, you know, years of experience doing it. But then when you talk to CISOs and you say, how many of you actually need CRQ? Well, it's a very small number. Well, the reason why that is a framing problem. And when companies start this, and when practitioners and our champions start to go out and evangelize FAIR, and we talk about this and we get excited about it, right? We've all been there before, right? What we're doing is that we're talking about the wrong things, and we're forgetting why we're doing this in the first place. Because on that same survey, when we asked how many of you CISOs want to know how a newly discovered cyber attack will affect your environment, or you'd like to know which controls are really reducing risk, and which of those controls can we probably remove or reduce and not materially change our risk landscape, right? 94% of them said that they wanted that. So what this is telling me, right, is if we think about this, in perspective, is that we're not positioning our risk quantification and our fair-based programs effectively. We're too busy focused on the technical aspects of this, the data, the math, the modeling, these kinds of things, and we're not focused on the outcomes and the value we're actually driving for the business. And this is what our leaders want. Now, we talked about this, we've been doing this for a long time. If you're like me and probably many of us on the call, right, I have just received, a couple of days ago, the second edition of Measuring Managing Information Risk, right? The first edition of this came out in 2014, right? So it's been a while. We have learned a lot along the way, right? When you hear Jack talk about some of the assumptions that we had and some of the things that we've learned, now, and Luke will probably correct me here, 17,000 practitioners, trained and know how to use FAIR and are members of the Institute. This is a huge amount of experience to learn from, right? And the quote that I always like to use when I'm helping our customers, our clients with this, is like, everybody says you want to learn from your mistakes. Well, the reality is I would rather learn from everybody else's mistakes and take advantage of that so I don't make those mistakes myself. And so when you look at some of the revisions, and for those of you that have started going through and dog-earing these pages, you'll notice there's a couple of new chapters in here. And we're going to talk a little bit about these, right? We're going to spend a little bit of time on this, right? But the revised second edition specifically goes into some of the challenges with adoption. It specifically goes into how to align this to frameworks and regulatory requirements, right? These are things that are game changers, and specifically, how do we start to use data and automate some of these things as well to get that value? The other thing that we've learned as we've gone through this is that FAIR is a means to an end, not the end of itself, right? This is a framework, this is a model, this is a way to do this consistently and defensibly and transparently. But what it's missing is, how do we integrate this with the rest of the organization, right? How do we, going back to those failure modes that we're going to spend a little bit of time on here, right? How do we make this part of the decision-making process itself, not just an aside or a one-off exercise, right? And when we look at that, if you have not been in the Resource Center recently, or if you haven't been following along, the CRMP has just been recently released, right? And so really appreciate some of the work that Todd and Luke and the working group has put into this. Some fantastic contributors have put their time and experience into this and laid out, again, kind of the foundation of how do you actually build a program that lays this out, right? What's the blueprint that we're going to use to tie, the governance, the systems, the model, the strategy, the execution, the life cycle around that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that, right? And specifically, how we implement this at SAFE, right? And when we look at all these lessons learned, all the things that we're talking about, I'm going to give you a roadmap of, again, how I've done this in the past and how we do this with our customers. And again, and I think we have a slide issue here, but what we've learned, right, is that leaders don't want CRQ, right? As hard as it is for me to say that, as somebody has spent the last decade and a half of their career in this world doing this, right? Our leaders, our executives, our CISOs don't want CRQ, right? They want intelligence that helps them drive action. And I think remembering this and keeping this in mind as we go through this and operationalize this, it's important that we stop selling CRQ and FAIR, right? And again, this is going to sound counterintuitive. That's why we're all here today, right? But the reality is we need to stop selling it, right? What we need to do is we need to sell the ability to clearly make informed decisions, right? When we think about the way we present results, and I'll spend a little time on this, the numbers that we're presenting, these are not the results, right? Yes, we're quantifying risk. We're talking about things like, probable loss magnitude. We're talking about things, like loss event frequency and susceptibility, and these great concepts that help us communicate risk. Well, the problem with that is, right, that isn't what our stakeholders want, right? The output that we should be producing is not a number, it's recommended actions and it's risk trade-offs, right? These are the things that are going to make this successful as we go out and socialize this, right? So when you think about how to measure your program and you think about how we're operationalizing this again, the metric that we should keep in mind is, did we influence the priority, spend, or risk acceptance in a real decision, right? And what that actually means, right, is that we have a contract with the business, right? The whole reason that we do this is so that we can communicate risk in business terms, right? I think it's on the Fair and Suit webpage, right on the front page. Well, the contract that we're making as risk practitioners is that we're going to use these methods and these mechanisms so that we can help you make better and faster decisions. We can align better to the business, and we can provide defensible, suggestions and recommendations, right? So remember, the means to an end, not the end in of itself. And people don't want math, right? They want permission to act with evidence, right? So when you think about this, and I'll share a couple of examples here in a minute, but when I look back at the work that our customers do and the stakeholders and those champions that are successful, right, what they're doing is they're enabling decision makers to make that decision, right? We're trying to help them make an informed decision, right? And if you've ever tried to make any kind of business decision that has significant consequences or money on the line, right, what you are looking for is permission to make that decision in an informed way. Right. And so when I say this, right, that's what we can bring to the table. And I'm going to go through this here in a minute. But as we think about what we're doing with FAIR, and if we think about what we're doing in our risk program, right, we want to be able to give our CISO, our business stakeholders, permission to act and know that they're making that decision in the most informed way they can. Okay. So let's go back really quick to those failure modes, right? So if we think about this from like an engineering perspective, right? When we look at a bridge, or we look at a software system, or these kinds of things, right? There are typical weak points in those systems where things tend to fail, right? And so I previewed a couple of these that I have seen over and over and over again, and our team deals with on a daily basis. Right. The first thing that I'm going to talk about a little bit is scope. So when we talk about scope, right, and again, like in chapter 2, right, of the book, right, we think of scope traditionally as risk practitioners as our asset, our threat, our outcome, our method, right, the scoping a fair scenario, right. But the reality is the scope should be the decisions that we're helping inform. Right. And so when I see organizations that struggle with this, right, they try to boil the ocean, what they're doing is they're scoping a program based on scenarios, right? We want to understand our top risks across our crown jewel applications. We have 7 regional business units. We want to be able to understand the top risks across each one of those. Well, that's a great goal, but at the end of the day, what decision does that help make? And what you'll end up doing is that you'll spend months and months and months workshopping and scoping all of these scenarios. But the reality of that is, right, we need to be focusing on the decision that we're helping inform, right? And so when we say, scope here, change your mindset a little bit about what that means, right? What are we doing as risk practitioners to operationalize this within our company, right? We are scoping a decision, right? And my starting point in the methodology that we use at SAFE is that we start with one decision, one scenario, one output, right? So we want to understand how to help you make a meaningful decision within the first 30 days of starting the program. Now, again, as somebody that is coming from SAFE, where we automate this and do say FAIR at massive scale, like starting with this small scope seems like the wrong way to do it. But the reality is, what this allows you to do is have clarity of focus, right? We can talk about the thing that we're doing, right? We don't get lost in the details, right? And we can remind our champions and our stakeholders and our executives why we're doing this, and we're showing results quickly, right? So when we think about operationalizing this, that's the scope that we're talking about. The flip side of that, right, kind of the second failure mode, when we talk about doing these analyses, and when you go through training, you talk about data, and we talk about calibrated estimates, and we talk about FAIR CAM, and this very complex web that we're building around the methods and the controls, and which loss event controls matter, right? The problem is that allows us to become overwhelmed very quickly. The challenge 15 years ago, and when you look at the first edition of measuring and managing information risk, well, we didn't have any way to get a lot of this data, right? And that's why a lot of this was led with workshops and calibrated estimates and these kinds of things, which is a great way to supplement some of that. But then what's happened in the last 10 years is that we've actually solved the problem too well, right? We actually have too much data now, and it becomes overwhelming as a risk analyst. As as a CISO, you have 37 different tools that are all providing you metrics and information and data about your program. Well, how do we overcome this paralysis that we get, right? What I hear constantly in companies that are struggling with this, right, is that we need better data, right? Well, what does that actually mean? Well, the problem is that that's an excuse, right? Saying that we need better data is an excuse to spend more time thinking about this, because what ends up happening as a practitioner, we're worried about getting the number wrong, right? We're worried about going to our executives or going to the board with something that doesn't hold up. And if we do this, it causes this kind of data paralysis, this analysis paralysis, where we'll spend weeks or even months trying to chase even more quote unquote perfect data. Well, the reality of that is that is going to delay the whole program. Now, if you go back to your FAIR fundamentals, your FAIR foundations training, right? We talk about making usefully precise but accurate estimates. Well, how do I know what usefully precise means? But like back in the day, I used to teach the FAIR foundations courses. The example we always used, right, was estimate how tall I am, right, and which is great over a webcam. Well, the reality is, how precise do you need to be depends on what we're doing, right? So if I'm trying to determine how tall the ceilings in my new house need to be, right, just knowing that I'm under 10 feet tall is usefully precise, right? Whereas if I'm trying to order new pants online, I probably need to know within an inch or two. So the reality is, we don't know if we have good enough data unless we understand the questions that we're trying to answer and the decisions that we're trying to inform, right? And so the other challenge with this is that I hear constantly, especially at SAFE, where we bring in a lot of real telemetry, and we're integrating with systems of record and these kinds of things, that the data is not quote unquote good enough, right? Well, the reality is that the defensibility right? You're never going to have perfect data. We're never going to know everything, right? The adage I always use is that if I knew all of the, if there's no uncertainty in this analysis, well, I wouldn't need to do any of this, right? I would just know the answer. I wouldn't need FAIR. But the reality is all of these models and our practice as a profession is based on uncertainty. And so to do that, we need to acknowledge that we'll never have perfect data, right? We'll never have all the information that we need at our fingertips. So we want to make that transparent and defensible. And that's how we overcome this paralysis that most practitioners get into, right? It's okay to go and present our results or to help, make that decision if we can stand behind the information that we're using and acknowledge where there may be gaps or where we have assumptions, right? But that's what we call transparency. The other thing that helps a lot, right, if you're new to this is FAIR CAM, right? So FAIR CAM allows us to essentially apply controls to our risk scenarios and understand how they're influencing those scenarios and in that way, how to measure those controls across multiple different dimensions, right? And this helps us make this repeatable, right? So when we think about that data paralysis question, right? The paradox is, we always think we need better data. We always need, we don't want to get it wrong. But the reality is it's never going to be 100% accurate. I'm sorry, it's never going to be 100% precise, but we can make that transparent. And this is the important. This is how we build trust. The third piece of this as well, right? I see this more and more as we've been doing this for a while. There's organizations, and some people may feel that this is what's going on at your own company, where there's a lot of momentum. We built out a risk management program. We adopted FAIR. We're used to this now, but we're doing work that doesn't go anywhere, right? I see this especially like in the third-party space. I work with a lot of companies that are bringing risk quantification and FAIR to third-party risk management, and it's a lot of work. We're doing a lot of things. We're producing wonderful reports and charts and insights, but nothing happens with it, right? So to think about this problem, right, we need to go back again to that mantra I keep repeating, that we need to help make decisions. If we are not built into the decision-making process, right, we are going to be shelfware, right? That's just unfortunately the reality of the thing. And when we think about what we're trying to do from a risk management perspective, we focus on the numbers, we focus on the report, we focus on the analysis or the results. But what is actually going to help most organizations, and I see this time and time again, is often not the actual numbers, right? What matters to most stakeholders and what's going to help me make decisions isn't that the number is 62, right? Or the loss event frequency is 0.4, right? What actually helps make that decision and what is actually useful information is the delta, right? What's the difference? Is that number going up or down? If I do this project, what would I expect to see in 6 months, right? And the quote I use all the time, right? CRQ FAIR-based analysis is not a report. It's not an analysis, right? It's a diff. Right. So going back to our software engineering model here, right, we want to understand the diff, right? What is changing over time from my baseline or in the future, right? So I think when we talk about this is how you make these things actionable and useful, right? The fourth piece of this, right, we talked a little bit about our risk team being trapped in a corner. So what does that mean? Well, what that means, I've seen this, I don't know how many times now at organizations that have built out a program, right? They have put a lot of time and effort into this. They've built a risk center of excellence, right? They've got a dedicated team that has gone and got FAIR certified and completely understands this. Well, the problem that drives is that now we have, we have this room full of risk analysts that are very good at their job, that are understand this, right? This is what I love to do, right? We like to nerd out about this stuff. We like to do the work, but we're not in the process, right? So what that means is that if we're not built into that business process, right, into that budgeting, into the third party life cycle, the vulnerability management or the project management workflows, we are going to be relegated to be in this, in the cobweb covered cubicle in the corner, and we're not actually going to be able to deliver value, right? And so what this ends up being is a trap where we're not getting this program adopted, we're not operationalizing this, and the decision makers in the organization, our business partners, don't view us as helpful, right? And that's the problem. We call this risk theater, right? We're doing a lot of work, we're producing a lot of things, but at the end of the day, it's not making any difference. The way we solve this, right, and the way that this works in practice is, there's a concept called context and core. So when we think about the business processes out there and the systems that support it, if we think about like the classic example of this is like our payroll system at our company. Well, the payroll system is a very important system to the employees, right? But at the end of the day, that does not give our organization any competitive advantage, right? That does not, it does not, directly affect our customers or the product that we're selling or, our value proposition as an organization, right? But it is, if it goes down or if it goes wrong, right, we are going to have a bad day, right? And our employees are not going to be happy. A lot of risk management programs are like that, right? We're not actually driving real business value, right? But we're a bottleneck. We're a cost center, right? We're expensive, we're time consuming, these kinds of things. What we want to be able to do is that we want to shift from a context, business context process to something that is core to that, right? We want to be able to deliver, business value. We want to help our organization, deliver our products better. We want to be able to, add direct money to the bottom line, right? And this is challenging in the risk reduction business, right? Many times we communicate, the potential, loss exposure, right? With the reduction in loss magnitude, right? These are the ways that we talk as FAIR practitioners. But the reality of that is, right, that's very intangible. So what we want to be able to do is that we want to be, like we talk about being the system of record, but we want to be able to influence that bottom line, right? We want to help the CISO make a better decision about how to allocate that budget, right? And if we can identify the controls that are redundant or least effective, right, we can make a meaningful contribution to the bottom line of the company, right? So when we think about how we operate as a risk program, the successful risk programs that have achieved this level of operationalization are involved in the core business processes, right? They're not producing analyses on a quarterly basis. The other piece of this, and the kind of the last failure mode we talk about is trust. And it's funny that we're talking about this at the FAIR, FAIR Institute, right? FAIR exists to be an open, standard, and transparent model, right? That is, is trustworthy and that, eliminates these black box, scoring models and, heat map, voodoo, and these kinds of things. But what I see more often than not is that we have taken, these concepts and we've layered additional black boxes on top of it, or we have, not kind of followed our best practices and, the things that are, in chapter, 13 here, right, that talk about how to do this. And what this ends up becoming is that FAIR programs will start with the best intentions, but very quickly become guessing with more work, right? And what I mean by that is that these best practices, these things that are in here, are hard, right? If you have tried to do fair risk analysis at scale, you know how hard it is to do this, right? And there are systems and ways to improve that. But what ends up happening is we start taking shortcuts. The complaints come in that this is taking too long, it's too burdensome, it's too much work, too many workshops, these kinds of things. So what we end up doing is that we start creating shortcuts, right? We start creating matrices of things, right? We start using kind of predefined assessments of controls and calibrate estimates that are based on kind of my finger in the air rather than defensible rationale. And what that does is we've now brought ourselves full circle, and now we're still doing the same type of output. Maybe it's a little bit more transparent, but we're losing trust in the process, right? We went to sell this within our organization, by touting all those benefits, all of the objectivity, the data-driven, statistical modeling of this, but we bring it all back, and now we're reintroducing the same problems we were trying to get away from. So how do we solve this, right? The way that we do this, again, is very hard to do at scale without platforms. And obviously I'm biased, coming from SAFE, but you need ways to do this repeatably, right? We say at SAFE that never trust anything you can't, double click on or even triple click on and see where it comes from. The components of this is, I call them drivers, provenance, and transparency, meaning I need to know what is driving a decision, a result, or an analysis, right? What's the provenance, right? Where did this come from? Where did the information and the assumptions actually come from? And it needs to be transparent. I need to be able to show that in, as an open book, right? And the problem is that if you try to do this at scale, it's very hard to do that without systems in place. Now, there are some great things in FairCam that allow us to do that. It becomes very complex at scale without systems and platforms. But we want to be able to connect the drivers, right, via Fair and FairCam, right? We want to show the provenance of that, right? We need to be able to drill into how we assessed and how we got the data for that, right, through telemetry or assumptions and calibrated estimates. And we need to be able to show our work, right? I need to, as I'm presenting and I'm having these conversations, within 2 clicks, quote unquote, get from the headline to the raw data. Okay. So what does all this look like? These are these failure models, right? This is how how they're most effectively addressed. So what does this look like, right? This is the new operating model. This is what this is what we use at SAFE with our customers, and what I've iterated off of over years. Back to our mantra, right? CRQ isn't a report. It's a rhythm, right? This is a risk management lifecycle. If you look at any of the frameworks, any of the models out there, right, you are going to recognize the circle, the triangle, the pyramid, whatever the case is. But the idea is that this is a continuous process. And the way that I like to highlight this, and this is the the life cycle that we try to, or the rhythm that we try to implement, is that we need to first understand the decision that we're trying to make. We need to be able to detect the change when that happens, because it's changing all the time. We need to be able to quantify the impact of that change, right? Remember, this is the delta is where the value is in most decisions. We need to be able to explain the drivers. So why did that number change? Where did it come from? And how do I know that, right? What's the provenance of that? I need to be able to act. So I need to be able to make recommendations to my, to those decision makers and stakeholders that is tied to these things. And then I need to be able to actually measure that, right? I need to be able to observe the action plan and be able to answer the question through change, have we achieved the goals that we set out, right? And so this is the model that, this is the rhythm that we want to implement when we're operationalizing, CRQ and fair-based programs. So what does it look like, right? Like in practice. So what I did is I pulled, this is an example, right? This is a, first 30 days. So at SAFE, when we kick off with a new organization that is just starting this process, or they're moving from something else, right? We want to deliver, what we call our first desired outcome in 30 days. So that first month, as you're building out your program, should focus on delivering a concrete decision, right? And this is a hard and fast deadline, right? We don't extend this out, right? Within 30 days, right? Use your project management triangle. We can define scope, budget, and time, right? We are going to lock in our time. We will deliver something within 30 days, right? And that should be a meaningful decision. Now, the value of this is what it allows you to do is to exercise that cycle very quickly, right? So within within this first month, we can actually deliver a meaningful decision. We can, keep that scope limited to, what's required to do that, but it activates the loop, right? So if we have delivered that decision, and we've built an action plan, we've made a recommendation, and we've helped somebody make that informed decision, well, the loop is now triggered, and we're going to continue to monitor that decision so that we can understand the diff. Are we actually seeing the results that we wanted? And this is the difference between an academic exercise, a report that's going to go on the shelf and a great PowerPoint deck that nobody will open again, to actual risk management. Right. And so when we do that, when we bring this in, right, the way we look at this is that we define the decision. What are we trying to do? What's the scenario that is meaningful here? Right. How do we know what will drive our decision? Right. What will it take? If I'm thinking about investing in a new tool or funding a project, what would it take, to the CISO or to the, your business partner or board to make you change your mind, right? So if the plan is to launch this project, what would it take to not launch that project? Okay, so that's important. Now, what we can do is that we can, now we go back to the part that we're all familiar with and all very good at. Let's actually model that out. Different ways to do this, but what we want to be able to do is to identify the drivers, right? What are the things that matter, right? This is where fair cam, MITRE ATT&CK, these things are very useful. If we can identify the drivers, we can now instrument the diff. So we can understand when those drivers change. And we can monitor those drivers so that we know when things are changing, how is that going to affect the model that we've built? And now we can report and we can understand that. And the goal and the output, what I like to deliver here, is a decision package, right? Not a risk assessment report, not a loss exceedance curve, right? But a decision package, something that actually helps the organization or that decision maker make the decision. And this looks very different. It almost looks like a business case in most scenarios, right? It's what are the options, right? What are the forecasts? How do these options help us reduce risk, or what are the trade-offs with those? And most importantly, what's my recommendation as the risk expert here? And when we do that, that allows us to, again, create a pattern, build trust, make this thing actionable, and something that we can lay the foundation for an ongoing process around. Now, once we do that, once we've delivered that first decision, now we're in the rhythm. What we're going to do is we're going to monitor that. And the reporting shifts from this decision package to, like we call it, see what changed, right? Every month, every quarter, whatever the right cadence is for your organization, we're delivering on those initiatives and on those scenarios that we've modeled out, that what I call the risk landscape. What has changed? What are the drivers, and what's the provenance of the data that told me that? Now, once we've done this, we've established a cadence. We're built into a process. We've helped actually drive business value in the first month. Now we can scale. So if I can help you make one decision, how do I help you make all decisions, right? How do I go into adjacent decision areas? We talked about project prioritization. What about third-party risk reviews? What about our vendor selection process, right? These are the things that we can start to look at. And now we can expand this and we can grow that program. Okay, so I've covered a lot of ground here, and I'm going to pause for questions in just a minute. But what I did want to do, just in the last, I'm going to spend about 2 minutes just to kind of again, to bring this home, to kind of show you, how do we actually do this? So it's safe, right? As I mentioned, I lead a team. We, support, several hundred customers that are doing this at scale with automation, in huge programs all over the world, right? So how do we actually do this with safe, right? With our platform. Everything I've talked about, you can do. You don't need any platform to do in the beginning, right? Now to scale it, it obviously becomes easier. But what this looks like, right, is that you need, as you build a program, to have the decision-making tools, right? So if you think about this, all other, CXOs in the organization have their, their system of record, if you will, right? Their decision-making platform, right? Our head of sales or chief revenue officer lives in Salesforce all day, right? The CIO is driving things through ServiceNow. The CFO is in SAP, monitoring the financial position of the company. SAFE is the Salesforce, SAP, ServiceNow for the CISO, right? This is the system of intelligence, right? This is the platform where CISOs can actually drive their program, right? And what our goal here is to help that CISO make decisions in this platform and have a reliable place where they can quickly get the answers that they need, right? So if you're not familiar, right, SAFE, we're the kind of the undisputed market leader in this space. We've been doing this for a very long time across a lot of different things, and we've built a platform that helps to do this. And how do we do that, right? Like, what is SAFE? Well, what SAFE is a way to take all of this information that we just talked about, right? The business context, the threat intelligence data, all of the telemetry, all of this disparate information and data that's all over our organization that's going to help us, make these decisions and do this. It allows us to aggregate all this information using FAIR, right? Using FAIR CAM, and connect the data to the decision through the models and be able to show that provenance. And at the end of the day, we want to help you make that decision, right? And so what is that, the output side of this we can go into, and I'll show you an example here. But fundamentally, right, what we do is that we take, this chart that you've all seen. I've marked this up here and I stopped the animation, right? We all know about, threats against assets with impacts, and we have controls, and we model these with FAIR CAM and FAIR MAM, right, in the forms of loss. Well, SAFE lets you work at all angles of this in a single platform, right? So we bring in threat intelligence data that helps us understand the threat event frequency across all of these different combinations of things in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We look at the FAIR CAM model, and we help bring in telemetry and data and signals that help us and frameworks that help us to measure in a defensible and transparent way the effectiveness and capability and coverage of these controls. And then also understand the impact of these things using FAIR MAM and industry loss data, organizational information that you can bring into the platform. And so what this looks like, again, in practice, is we can take our risk landscape of all the groups, all the applications, all the business units in our organization, right? And we can understand what this looks like. And I know this looks scarily like a heat map, but what this actually is, it's plotting loss event frequency or likelihood times loss magnitude, right? And we're looking at this on a scatter plot. Well, I can, at a glance, as a CISO, identify, well, these are the groups that are above my risk threshold, right? These things are above, have a material loss magnitude if they occur, and they're more likely to occur than I'm comfortable with. And I can focus on these top two areas, drill into those and understand what are the scenarios that are actually driving that risk. Why are these our riskiest applications? What are the things that could happen, right? The actual loss event scenarios. And with that, what are the drivers that are causing the most impact, right? What are the controls from a FAIR CAM perspective that would have the biggest impact on these scenarios that are driving the risk in our riskiest applications? And what can I do about it, right? I can make that actionable. And what that allows me to do is to go back to my decision makers, or if I'm a CISO, I can look at this and say, if I implement these changes, or I improve these things, or I close these findings coming out of our tools, right, this is what I can actually do to our loss exposure across the organization. And I can tie that to a concrete business plan. I can tie this to a project or an initiative that has a cost associated with it. And if I've scoped that and I can understand what we're doing and what the cost is and what the potential benefit is, I can understand the ROI of that project. And when I do that, and I'm doing this through an automated platform, I can now track that project and I can understand, am I achieving the goals that I wanted? And when I see something change, why did it change, right? Why did the likelihood of a loss event jump? Why did it go down? Well, it's because we were executing on this project and we were achieving the results that we want. And I can show that we haven't quite met our goal yet. We still got some work to do. So I'm going to pause here so we have a few minutes left. I think we have a couple of questions. And Luke, I don't know if you're moderating those. If not, I'm happy to jump in there. But hopefully this was helpful. And my contact information is in here. If you do want to talk more about this, I'm happy to kind of share some more stories from the trenches as well.
Thank you so much, Vince. And thanks everybody for participating today. And we do have a few questions here. So with the remaining couple of minutes, I'll present them to you. Vince, first one here is, what's your response to people who say that FAIR is hard? You have given us a couple of examples throughout this of needing more data and understanding that FAIR is the means to an end. But when people say, well, it's just hard, what is your response to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the reality is it is hard, right? And I think, that's that. And so how do we do hard things, right? Like, well, one, we try to break them down to be, simpler, right? So we talk about scope. We talk about kind of, the sources. We, use tools to help with that, right? And a shameless plug here, right? Things like SAFE that can, help organize a FAIR-based program. And we practice, right? So the reality of it is, we do this, it's the Kennedy quote, right? We do these things because they are hard, because they produce better results, right? Not because they're easy. If we wanted to take the easy way out, we could all use red, yellow, and green and go back to that. But how do you make it easier? I think is maybe the better question. And you do that again, kind of through these failure modes, right? If we talk about those 5 failure modes, right? Many of the claims that FAIR is too hard are proxies for articulating one of those failure modes that has happened or is anticipated to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Good things don't come easy is another quote that I think of often that I talk with members about when faced with this question. Another final question here is, when folks, and I see this a lot too, and I ask a lot of people when we do meet a member interviews or presentations at FairCon, I ask their insight on how to best communicate results of these scenarios. Again, the scenarios even themselves are sometimes the means to an end, and the end is educating the business and the executives on the information that they need to know to make better informed business decisions.
Yeah.
So what are your tips and tricks of the trade that you've seen over the years in terms of selling the results to the business and communicating them most effectively?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, again, not to sound too much like a broken record, but a lot of this goes back to, and I've been guilty of it as well. Like I said, I wrote I wrote a blog post about this 8 years ago. And it's almost embarrassing now how off base it was, right? About how to operationalize this. Is that the reality is that, we've learned over the last decade, right? As I talked about, that leaders don't want CRQ, right? So if we're communicating in, ALEs and loss exceedance curves and, bow tie diagrams and these kinds of things, we're probably doing it wrong. And the reality is that we need to understand, how does this information help make that more informed decision, right? So back to that example, I'm trying to, help the CISO prioritize a project or understand if it's worth investing in this new tool. Well, I can spend, days going through all of the, all of the loss event scenarios, and, that susceptibility will change by 14% if we do this and these kinds of things. But none of that is actually going to help him make a more informed decision, right? So when we put it in terms of, well, if we do this, right, and go back to the kind of what's going to move the needle. If we do this, we're reducing the likelihood of a ransomware attack being successful, right, by a measurable amount. I can show my work on that. But more importantly, if we don't do this, right, here's where we're at, right? So the decision I'm helping you make is, do we invest in this new tool, right? Do we invest in a different tool, or do we do nothing? Right? Are we comfortable with the level of risk that we have today, right? And then presenting those options with my recommendation as an analyst, as an expert, that's the thing that is going to tend to communicate best. The flip side of that, that's kind of for individual decision. What I like to focus on, like we talked about here as well, was let's go back to this slide, right? Risk is dynamic, it's continuous, it's changing all the time. We don't deliver risk assessments. We're showing what's changed in the environment, right? And I think when we talk about dashboards, we talk about, board reports and these kinds of things, the primary emphasis, the primary metric should be the change, right? Not the number, not the ALE, not the, the aggregate loss magnitude, right? But what has changed since the last time we talked? And why has it changed, right? And to me, those are the things that are going to make that communication most effective.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are at time here today for this webinar. I want to be cognizant of everybody's time, but really appreciate folks who have tuned in today. Like Vince said, his information is on the slide. If you want to learn more, discuss more, have any other questions, encouraged to please reach out to him, or you can reach out to me and I can get you connected with Vince. Again, this webinar has been recorded. We're going to share the recording with everybody and also post this in the member resources library of the FAIR Institute. But Vince, thank you again very much for your time today. And thank you all for attending. And I wish everybody happy holidays and a happy new year.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.